It's fair to say that Capcom has been on a bit of a roll lately, and with Devil May Cry 5, that streak looks to continue. With a stylish presentation, a new engine, and years of experience under its belt, it's the perfect time to revive the series. It's been 11 long years since Capcom produced an in-house Devil May Cry game though, so how does 5 stack up? Beyond the game itself though, Devil May Cry also represents a major shift in technology for the series. The new engine in question is the RE engine, and this release marks the first non-Resident Evil game to have been developed using this. With a different style of game progression and a focus on faster action though, it also pushes the engine to new heights. And in addition to that presentation, a central pillar of the main series has always been its silky smooth 60 frames per second frame rate. The demo was certainly promising in that regard, but how does the full game stack up? Today then, we're going to explore the impressive visuals on display in Devil May Cry 5 while tackling all 4 console versions of the game, both from an image quality and performance standpoint. How has the game evolved since the demo, and which version is best? All that and more is coming up on this look at
Devil May Cry.
When you first fire up Devil May Cry 5, it's clear that Capcom's sense of fun and style has returned in full force. The cutscene direction and action on display is pitch perfect for the series, but it's the evolution in visual design that really hits home. Without a doubt, the artists and engineers on this project have hit a home run with some of the most striking moments we've seen in quite some time. With such visuals on display, it's nice to see the game looking great across every console with minimal visual differences to distinguish between them. This is our first point of comparison then, and primarily it comes down to resolution. From the top, Xbox One X features the highest pixel count, coming in at 2160p or 4K, but it seems like some sort of reconstruction is used to achieve this. Something evident when examining camera cuts like this. Check out the artifacts here on this edge. Reconstruction is also used on PlayStation 4 Pro to reach what appears to be 1800p. Due to the way in which the game renders, however, it's rather difficult to see a noticeable difference between the two during normal play. And this really comes down to the way the image is treated. There's a heavy focus on post-processing effects such as chromatic aberration, which reduce pixel clarity. This is not a sharp game, it's a clean one. That said, anti-aliasing is more effective on Xbox One X, leading to less visible aliasing on edges like this. While we're here, I also noticed a subtle difference in how bloom is rendered between the two versions, which you can see on the blue decoration here. This is possibly due to the variation in anti-aliasing. I spotted a similar difference in shadow rendering. Shadows appear ever so slightly cleaner on Xbox One X compared to the Pro. It's subtle enough that it too could be related to overall image treatment. One other odd thing I noticed, look at this scene here. In certain areas there is a visible flicker, like interlace flicker on a CRT television. This seems to be a byproduct of the reconstruction method, but it was most noticeable on PS4 Pro. How strange. One last thing to mention here, the PS4 Pro version appears to downsample, so if you set your console to 1080p, the game is still rendering at a higher resolution and simply downsampling to 1080p, which means improved image quality, but there is no boost to performance. Now the base consoles are even closer, with both turning in a 1080p pixel count. The thing is, Xbox One S appears to use the same reconstruction as its bigger brothers, while the base PS4 seems to be native 1080p. The PS4 version certainly looks a tad sharper overall, but really this is a rather nice solution for the older Xbox One hardware. The point here is that everyone should be rather satisfied with the selected resolutions. It's higher than Resident Evil 2 on the Pro and the X, and honestly it's just a very clean looking game. Those resolutions appear to be static as well. I didn't spot any evidence of dynamic resolution. Now, jumping into the meat here, as a character action game, Devil May Cry 5 places its characters front and center at all times. The camera field of view is relatively constrained with a tight focus on the action, though if you prefer, it is possible to adjust camera distance using the options menu. Oh, and speaking of the options, this is another Capcom game which requires careful brightness adjustment for your specific setup. The default settings are washed out and overly bright. It's especially noticeable if you're playing on an OLED where the default black levels glow almost like an old LCD. Now, throughout the game you'll encounter characters both in gameplay and during cutscenes. Now there's nothing unusual about that, but DMC5 is an especially story-driven game at points, and there's a lot of cutscenes in here. And it just so happens that these cutscenes deserve special attention. Firstly, these real-time cinematics allow the artists and designers to really showcase their skills using complex camera work rooted in real-world camera gear and impressively directed sequences. Take this opening credit sequence for instance. The entire scene takes place in slow motion as Nero moves around the scene. Credits are affixed to various parts of the scenery, complete with shadows, to dramatic effect, but it's the detail of the animation that really sells this moment. Watch Nero's movements closely. His lengthy coat whips around realistically with proper momentum without egregiously clipping through his body or other enemies. His feet realistically land on surfaces as he throws his weight around, while his arm dances between enemies as he lines up shots. Also note things like the materials on his boots. The physically based leather material is suitably shiny, yet its imperfections are clearly visible and it looks excellent. Same goes for other details on characters, or in fact around the scene itself. I especially love the tires on this van with individual self-shadowed modeled ridges. Look at the characters up close though, and the detail is even more astounding. The combination of highly realistic skin shading with subsurface scattering, wrinkles, and contortions lends the characters a sense of presence beyond most real-time graphics. Even whiskers are fully modeled, and how about those teeth? The thing is, sometimes it's easy to forget just how far we've come in terms of real-time graphics rendering. But if you compare Devil May Cry to something like, say, Final Fantasy VII Advent Children, the results are rather striking. This is an odd comparison to make, I suppose, but Advent Children is based on a game series and offered 3D rendered visuals far beyond what was possible on a game console in its day. There is a lot of similarities in the way certain scenes play out. Now, look at the character models here. The skin shading actually appears more natural in Devil May Cry 5, materials behave more realistically, and effects like bokeh depth of field and motion blur, while lower in precision, are present and suitably cinematic. Animation and scene complexity is comparable, though Advent Children can present larger crowds and more complex particle effects, among other things. It still has many of the benefits of a pre-rendered film, of course, but the result is surprising, I think. If this had been released on a Blu-ray disc back in 2005 or something, I think people would have been suitably impressed. Well, provided the aliasing on things like hair was cleaned up, that is. So it's impressive, though we still haven't managed to match Adam Driver in real time. That's the real goal here, I think. Capcom also provides owners of the deluxe version of the game a rather interesting bonus. I'm not necessarily one for bonus features like this in most cases, but in this situation, it's genuinely cool. Basically, this is a behind-the-scenes look at how the cutscenes were designed. Essentially, you can choose to swap in these filmed pre-visualization segments in place of most important cutscenes, and it offers a glimpse at how the design team tackled this aspect of the project. Typically, cutscenes like this need to be planned out well in advance and are often presented in a rough previs fashion. It's typical stuff, I suppose, but it's rare for a developer to share so much of it with the players while also implementing it into the flow of the game itself. You can see at this point that all the major beats are hit. Action scenes rely on small props, while objects such as the radio or the jukebox during this intro scene are represented with labeled objects instead. Actors, of course, take on the roles of the characters in all the cutscenes, and honestly it works surprisingly well. Which is of course the point, since pre-visualizing scenes like this helps the designers better plan out each sequence. And thankfully, no matter which console you're playing on, all of these scenes are pretty comparable. Obviously the higher end consoles deliver a higher resolution, but it's impressive to see real-time graphics of this quality on something like an original Xbox One. Now, while the cutscene sequences are mighty impressive indeed and do deserve attention, most people come to Devil May Cry for the gameplay, of course, and thus the visual quality combined with the performance is critical. In-game, character models are extremely detailed, but certain elements such as subsurface scattering appear to have been sacrificed in the name of performance. Still, material quality is retained and each model is highly detailed. All of this can be observed in the game's photo mode, which is a feature available right from launch. Once you take control, the camera follows the action closely, highlighting the smooth animation work on display. DMC games have always managed to offer responsive controls while exhibiting fluid animation, and this new game is no different. Every subtle swing of the sword, jump, or dodge is beautifully rendered here. Every time your sword strikes a surface, a light is generated, serving the purpose of highlighting your attack, making it more readable, while also playing nicely off materials, spicing up the visuals in the process. Blade trails distort the scenery, while a subtle radial blur is combined with particles to give further weight to the animation. There's a lot of careful design work that has gone into every action, and it feels great. Characters also make use of inverse kinematics, which enable proper foot placement while walking across sloped surfaces or uneven terrain. This basically ensures that your character feels more connected to the scenery, something enhanced further by animations like this. Notice how Nero shifts his weight as he changes directions, a nice touch. The point is, when looking at characters and enemies as a whole, the animation and modeling work on display is superlative. Devil May Cry 5 features some of the most detailed character models we've seen this entire generation. Then there's the environments, which, while not quite as striking as the character models, are nonetheless beautiful. Moving away from the more confined spaces featured in the last two Resident Evil games, DMC 5 takes place in and around a demon-infested cityscape at various times of day. You spend a lot of time moving through sewers, subway tunnels, and old buildings, which honestly seems rather dull on paper, but the results are still surprisingly attractive. First, there's a lot of nice material work on surfaces in the game. From stone and brick to man-made tiles like this, it all looks reasonably realistic. The environments lean heavily on indirect lighting as well, likely utilizing a pre-calculated solution to get there, which again, looks great. In addition, volumetric lighting is used regularly to enhance the mood, with streams of light convincingly penetrating dusty corridors. Volumetric lights look great across all console versions, but I'll be curious to see how it stacks up on the PC, as the high setting in Resident Evil 2 was quite demanding for many GPUs. Water is featured in several areas as well, usually in the form of small pools or fountains, with a nice geometric wave interaction pattern generated when moving through it. Reflections play off wet surfaces too, relying mostly on what appears to be box-projected cube maps rather than SSR. On top of that, in some areas, objects in the world can be destroyed during combat. Check out these bookshelves. Not all of them can be wrecked though, but a nice animation is still used to enhance the sense of interaction. Then of course we have the debris, which is scattered about the environment, lending everything a sense of ruin, while the more demonic areas are suitably grim. Honestly though, overall, while these areas may be somewhat pedestrian in nature, the team has managed to create something truly beautiful thanks to excellent art direction and the RE engine itself. What I most appreciate about the world design, however, is how the environment is so carefully designed to suit the combat. Most arenas are wide enough to allow for smooth combat and traversal with minimal camera frustrations. I say minimal, as there are still a few tighter areas which can prove troublesome for the right-stick camera system. Unlike the earliest games in the series, the camera is entirely manual, though it automatically recenters on your character while running through the environment. It tries to keep up, but you'll still need to manually adjust it often. Honestly though, level design-wise, there's a nice balance between attractive environments and streamlined combat zones. And all of it is enhanced by an excellent HDR implementation. Devil May Cry 5 avoids the washed out color grading present in certain areas of Resident Evil 2, instead presenting a punchy image that really seems to take advantage of the full dynamic range. So we have detailed scenery and richly crafted character models paired with RE Engine's excellent lighting and shadow capabilities, delivering a beautiful game all around. The artists and engineers alike have done a tremendous job here, and it's an excellent evolution from previous entries in the series, while still staying true to the series' design language. In that sense, the presentation is a complete success. So the next point I'd like to address then is loading. It's both an improvement over previous games, but also a letdown in certain other ways. Let me explain. So on the positive side, once you've started a mission, the entire chapter is seamless. I initially raised concerns about loading when checking out the Gamescom demo, but thankfully that demo was sliced in half. Normal progression is just as seamless as other games powered by the RE engine, at least most of the time. You see, there's one downside. Anything related to the upgrade and mission menu does require loading. When Nico rolls up in her van, you'll need to load into the van. Want to customize your moveset or gear? Another loading screen. Want to do anything at all from this menu? Yep, more loading. And that's really the issue. Moving between all these menus just isn't as seamless as I would have liked, and it's a tad distracting as a result. Speed is comparable across all consoles, I should note, but it remains a minor distraction during these sequences. Just something to consider. Now I suppose we should talk about performance. Devil May Cry is all about 60 frames per second gameplay, and each version of the game aims to deliver just that. The question is, how successful are they? Well, before we address the performance during the all-important gameplay sequences, let's talk about the slowest part first, the cutscenes. Yes, all those fancy visual effects come at a price, and that is performance. Thankfully, as these are non-interactive sequences, it's not really a big deal, and this winds up serving as more of a performance benchmark instead. So we're looking at PS4 Pro versus Xbox One X first here, and it's clear that neither of them can hold 60 FPS, but what is consistent is the gap between the two. And this is a fascinating result. The Pro version, which operates at a reduced resolution with less effective anti-aliasing, turns in between 5 to 20% faster performance on average. For this specific sequence then, the average frame rate on PS4 Pro is 42 frames per second, while Xbox One X comes in at 39 instead. We see a rather similar gap between the base consoles then, although Xbox One S takes the lead initially. For most of the scene, however, the PS4 exhibits a similar lead over the Xbox One S in this sequence, with an average frame rate coming in at 40 frames per second, while the Xbox One S comes in at an average of 36 frames per second, making it the lowest of the bunch. Thus, for this specific cutscene at least, PS4 Pro is the leader, followed by the base PS4 with Xbox One X just behind and Xbox One S coming in last. This level of performance is pretty much what you're going to find across the run of the game during cinematic cutscenes. Now, of course, gameplay is far more important and variable, so let's look at each version individually, starting with Xbox One X. Having played through the first 9 chapters now, I've selected a pair of combat sequences for testing which don't really spoil anything and offer 2 different types of visual scenarios. The first one was initially in the demo, and on the Xbox One X, performance is quite stable. What you see here for this specific scene is pretty much what you're going to get throughout most of the game, at least what I've found. A smooth 60 frames per second frame rate with an occasional hiccup here or there. The results are exactly as I had hoped, and it comes very close to hitting that locked 60 FPS most of the time. So how does PS4 Pro fare then in comparison? Well, again, the results are extremely similar overall, with a mostly locked 60 FPS frame rate, but the corner where X dropped frames exhibits even more drops on the Pro. Keep in mind though, gameplay is extremely variable, so it's difficult to make a definitive statement on this, with both versions averaging out to just above 59 frames per second for this sequence overall, which is really good, right? The next scene, however, is a little more interesting. The library features destructible objects and volumetric lights, so although the enemy count is rather low, there are some added stress points here. On Pro, this reveals 2 things. Basically, when the camera is too close to the action, or there's too many alpha transparencies near the camera, you're going to see a drop in frame rate, and that's exactly what happens in this test. In these instances, the performance can drop significantly, but only for a very brief period of time. This is, believe it or not, one of the slower sections I've tested throughout playing the game though, so it's not really a cause for concern, but it definitely does happen. The same is true of Xbox One X, which drops in exactly the same circumstances, but sometimes it drops even further. There's this extended bit here where the X drops frames for a rather long period of time compared to the Pro. It does recover, but the dips are noticeable when they occur. And the second one appears at the very end of this sequence during the cinematic finisher with the depth of field. This is where huge drops are present, but again, it recovers rather quickly. Still, overall, the Pro averages out to just about 59 frames per second, while Xbox One X comes in at 58 frames per second in comparison, so they're still very close to locking at 60 FPS during most of this battle. But what about the base consoles? Well, in our first sequence then, the base PS4 performs extremely well, turning in a near perfect level of performance across the board. In fact, it's the fastest of all the console versions in this specific instance, which is quite impressive indeed. The poor Xbox One S, however, does not fare so well, and is the only version that fails to run this sequence at a near locked 60 FPS. Instead, there are near constant dips below the 60 FPS target with a lower average frame rate overall. And unfortunately, everything else leading up to this moment is pretty much the same. There's just drops all over the place, and this is a real issue for the Xbox One version of the game. The performance just isn't good enough. It's not stable enough for a Devil May Cry experience. If we jump over to the library, then PS4 performs quite well for the most part, delivering performance on par with the more powerful consoles, only at 1080p. The only major deviation here stems from the final sequence with depth of field. The frame rate drops significantly during this segment, suggesting that this effect puts a strain on the PS4 GPU in a big way. That's nothing though compared to Xbox One S, which is quite poor throughout this entire battle. Again, like the first scene, the Xbox simply can't maintain 60 frames per second at all. The entire scene struggles, and it feels a lot less fluid to play overall. What I've found is that most battles on Xbox One S exhibit similar issues then, but you'll occasionally run across moments like this, which do come close to hitting and maintaining 60 FPS. Also, outside of combat when you're just running around the world, performance is reasonable most of the time, often hitting 60 FPS, though even that isn't perfect. Now, if we step back and consider all four machines here, the results are rather clear. On PS4 Pro, base PS4, and Xbox One X, gameplay performance is mostly locked to 60 frames per second throughout the game, which is exactly what you'd want in a Devil May Cry game. Exploration is nearly perfect, while most combat sequences are similarly smooth, but with small dips when certain visual effects appear on screen or in close proximity to the camera. It isn't quite as stable as, say, the PS2 Devil May Cry games, but it's close. When considering the visuals on display and the resolution in use, the results are quite impressive indeed. Xbox One S, though, is, how shall I say it, subpar. This is consistent with other recent titles we've tested on this older machine, unfortunately, where the original Xbox One just can't hang. If you're on this console, the game is still quite beautiful to behold, no doubt, and it's a lot of fun to play, but you're going to lose fluidity. This is not the optimal way to play Devil May Cry. So where do we stand then? Well, to summarize briefly, Devil May Cry 5 is a gorgeous game that serves as an impressive demonstration both for the RE engine itself and the development team. The frame rate is smooth across most platforms, the presentation is beautiful, and it has a wonderful sense of style. The real-time cinematics are especially stunning, often resembling offline CGI. When stepping back and looking at the big picture, there's this sense that Devil May Cry 5 is a spiritual successor to a PlayStation 2 game. It carries a lot of the elements that really made those games of that era so memorable, while still offering modern improvements. In many ways, DMC 5 feels like a proper follow-up to Devil May Cry 3 in particular. It's a throwback in the best possible way, and it takes great advantage of new technology. There's a lot of depth here, and as of capture, I'm really just scratching the surface. But as you unlock moves and begin to better grasp each mission, it becomes more and more rewarding. With the chapter selection, it's easy to replay any mission in the game as well, allowing you to work on your letter grades. Another thing I want to briefly mention here then is the audio. First, I'm enjoying the soundtrack. The over-the-top, vocal-backed battle tracks return, of course, but there's more variation in the music selection, and honestly, it never becomes grating. In fact, after being disappointed with the minimalistic use of music in Resident Evil 2 Remake, despite the otherwise amazing soundscape, this is kind of a breath of fresh air. The game also makes excellent use of surround sound, though it lacks the binaural audio feature of Resident Evil 2. You can at least hear enemies spawning in around you in real time, making it easy to plot your course of carnage across the battlefield. There really isn't too much to analyze here, of course, but I found myself fully engaged in the experience. Overall, what can I say? I love Devil May Cry 5 and cannot wait to get back in there and finish the game, only to replay it again. It's another notch on Capcom's belt, and I hope it finds the success it deserves. This is a game that focuses on the best of the series while bringing it into the modern age, just like other revivals Capcom has released over the recent years. If you've ever enjoyed Devil May Cry, give this one a look. Just, if you can, play it on something other than an Xbox One or Xbox One S for the best experience, which is to say, the PS4 Pro, Xbox One X, and base PS4 versions are all top choices. In fact, it's a close call as to say which version is best. I'd probably say that PS4 Pro has a slight edge in terms of overall performance, while Xbox One X has a slight edge in terms of image quality, but honestly, all three versions are great. But that's all for now. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to let us know by liking, subscribing, ringing the notification bell, and following us on Twitter. And until next time, up your game.